A key component to any workshop running smoothly is making sure that all of your tools are properly calibrated. This is definitely something that a lot of people, myself obviously included, tend to neglect. But ensuring proper alignment really is, or should be at least, a part of regular maintenance for any power tool. Every spring, I de-winterize all of my power tools. I sand off any little bits of rust that may have formed over the winter, and I apply a good coat of paste wax. But one thing that I don't do routinely that I really should is make sure that all of my tools are properly calibrated. So that's what I'm going to go over in this video, how to calibrate all of my power tools. Now, of course, I'm sure you don't own the exact same tools that I do, so the techniques are going to be a little bit different for each tool depending on the brand and the model. But they're all just variations on a theme. The concepts will be the same from tool to tool and brand to brand, even if the exact technique is not quite the same. But make sure you check your owner's manual for the exact procedure. I'm sure I have mine around here somewhere. And make sure your tools are unplugged before you do any of this. I'm going to start here at my miter saw because I find this one to be one of the more complicated ones, so I like to get that one over with first. There are 4 settings that I need to check to make sure that the miter saw is square and accurate. So I'm going to close it and then engage the lock. So the first thing I need to do is make sure that the blade is square to the table. I don't see any light coming behind the square, so that means that this setting is perfect. Next, I'm going to use a slightly larger square to make sure that the fence is square to the blade. And I should also say, make sure that your squares are actually square. So once again, I'm going to put the square against my fence, put it up against the blade, and that also looks good, so that's also perfectly square. The next thing I want to do is make sure that the fence is square to the table. And that also looks perfect, so that's also square. And the last thing I want to make sure is that the detent at 0 is still pointing at 0. If this is off, there's a little screw here that I can loosen and then adjust this pointer to where it needs to go. Okay, let's move on to the table saw next. It's basically the same procedure. First thing I'm going to do is make sure that the blade is square to the table, and that looks good. I should say that the blade is set to 0 degrees. And next, I'll check to make sure the fence is square to the table. I'm going to check this along the entire length, and that also looks good. For this style of table saw fence, there are screws underneath that will actually tilt the fence one way or the other if it's out of alignment. And the last thing to do is to make sure that the fence is parallel to the blade. The way that I'm going to do that is bring the fence a couple inches from the miter slot. I'm going to use one of these combination squares and set it so that it is just barely touching the fence. I'll lock that down. And now I will run it along the entire miter slot and make sure that it stays just touching the fence along the entire length. In case the fence is out of alignment that way, at least with this style, there are set screws right here which push on these little pads, and that will make the fence tilt one way or the other just slightly. And just like the miter saw, the last thing I want to double check is the pointer here. So I'm going to set this to exactly 8 inches. That's just an arbitrary number. And now I'll use my most accurate ruler to make sure that that actually measures 8 inches. That looks good, but if it were off, I would just loosen these 2 screws, adjust the pointer, and then retighten those screws. Next, I'm going to move on to the bandsaw, and there are 2 directions that I have to make sure the blade is square to the table. First is in the front and back direction, and that looks perfect. The other direction is this way, and you may actually be able to see just a touch of daylight between the top of the square and the blade up here, whereas there's no daylight down here. So that means the table actually is out of alignment. So I'm glad I'm doing this. Fortunately, this is a pretty easy fix. I'm just going to loosen the knobs underneath, and there should be a set screw over here that is the depth stop. Here is the depth stop here. It has a locking nut on the bottom that I will just loosen up. And I'm just going to screw this in about maybe a quarter turn or so. And then I'll retest it. Let's retest for square. That looks perfect, so I will just retighten the knobs, and now I'm done. Moving right along to the lathe, the only calibration I need to do here is to make sure that the tailstock and the headstock are aligned. So I have my favorite spur center in the headstock, my favorite live center in the tailstock, and I'm just going to bring them up to each other to see if they line up. And when viewed from the front, they line up perfectly in the up and down direction. And that's a good thing because there really isn't a great way to calibrate this. But when viewed from above, you can see they don't actually align perfectly. The tailstock is out of alignment a little bit in that direction. If this lathe had a fixed headstock, I would probably be in a little bit of trouble because there wouldn't be a great way to realign this. But this headstock does rotate, so I'm going to loosen this here, shift this around a little bit, and try to get this back into alignment. Now that looks much better. The headstock and the tailstock are now pointing exactly at each other. And finally, my least favorite tool in my entire shop, my jointer. It's not that I don't like this jointer, I actually love it. It's a great tool, it works really well. It's powerful and it does exactly what it's supposed to do. It's never given me any problems, but I'll go over all of this in more detail in a video in the future, but it is the tool that I regret buying the most, and that's for two major reasons. First, it's really big and I have a very limited amount of space in my shop. And second, it really only does one thing, which is to flatten and straighten boards. And there are other ways to flatten and straighten boards in the shop without a big jointer like this. Regardless, I have this tool, so I still need to make sure it's calibrated, so I'll get to that next. The two things I need to do for the jointer are make sure that the bed is square to the fence and make sure that the in-feed table and out-feed table are coplanar. That means that they are completely parallel to each other and not twisted at all. Testing for square is easy enough. First, I'll test the in-feed table, and that looks good. And now also the out-feed table, and that also looks perfect. If I did have to adjust the fence for square, I would first loosen this knob, and then the fence can be adjusted one way or the other, and then I can retighten it. There's also a depth stop here that can be adjusted. Just like on the bandsaw, this jointer has an adjustable depth stop. This bolt can be screwed in or out, and this strike plate ensures that the fence goes back to square each time. To check for coplanarity, and yes, that's the correct term, I double checked just to make sure, I'm going to use this really simple jig that I got the inspiration for from Garage Woodworks. The link will be down in the description. It's made of just a long strip of wood that is perfectly parallel. This is a piece of 1/2-inch plywood with 4 little wooden feet. And then I mounted my dial gauge on the end. I drilled a 3/8-inch through hole that the dial gauge fits perfectly through. To explain how this very simple jig works, I'm going to unfortunately have to talk a little bit about geometry. So try to think back to middle school. Actually, maybe don't. Anyway, to define a plane, you just need any 3 points in space as long as those points aren't on a line. So I'm going to use this jig to define 3 points on this plane, the in-feed table, and 3 points on this plane, the out-feed table. As long as this plane matches this plane with no discrepancies, then I know they are parallel or coplanar. I hope that makes sense. Sorry for the math lesson. Back to the woodworking. I'm holding pressure back here, and as I move the dial indicator down and across the outfeed table, there is very little movement of the dial indicator, maybe a thou or two, so these two tables are coplanar. Again, thanks to Garage Woodworks for the inspiration for that really simple but really easy to use jig. The other way to do that is with a straight edge and feeler gauges, but I don't have feeler gauges, so this was a perfect solution. Well, that's it for my big power tools other than my drum sander, but I think that's probably more a niche tool that most people probably don't have, so I might cover that in another video. If you want me to do that, please let me know down in the comments. Well, I know that wasn't the most exciting of topics, but I at least hope you learned something. It is definitely useful, so I hope you found it informative. If you did enjoy it, please let me know by hitting like, subscribe if you feel I deserve it, leave a comment, share it with a friend, and I hope to see you next time.